Meanwhile man immures himself behind rationalism and the machine because he is distressed by the possibility of being torn off his customary track and set the task of making himself anew. It is certainly far from beautiful to live amid mechanism, and is becoming insupportable, but it seems better to be a small cog in a big machine than to expose oneself to the peril of insecurity, staking one's whole existence on God is the greatest of all gambles. True, Pascal held that in this instance the gambler has nothing to lose and everything to win, but man, especially civilized man, is a troubled being, who may be dashing in small affairs, but otherwise lets himself go only when he has received solid assurances. Investment in God is a speculation of the highest magnitude. It means giving power of attorney over all that I am and have to a being I do not know, cannot see, and concerning whom I can get only the most contradictory accounts. The representative type which technical civilization keeps turning out on its conveyor belt is not favorably inclined to doing business upon such terms. Turning inwards is the only path today on which man can draw near the reality of God, but it is not a short path nor without grave difficulties. It has nothing to do with whether a man goes to church, reads the Bible, joins a new religious organization, to which he is most inclined, or even founds one himself. God reveals himself to the individual soul alone, and man is only able to find him in solitude. Every collective religious movement originates in the depths of individual existence, and anyone keeping his weather eye open for such a movement today is courting disillusionment. For man to turn from the world outside to the world within in an attempt to find reintegration in the lost depths of his own being is risky. But there is no other way, for the path to a new future does not lie straight ahead, as we have been accustomed to think. The path to the immediate future is so predetermined by the past that the only thing man can meet along it is that from which he is suffering today and would like to avert. A different future can only develop out of a changed past, so that paradoxically I cannot change the self I am today into the self I desire to be tomorrow unless I live again and change the self I used to be. Or, to use Solovyev's words, our present life cannot in truth be bound up with God so long as the actions of our past which we performed without God are yet burdening us. Before we can attain new salvation, we are called upon and bound to atone the old guilt. That is what the truth demands. The words of the depth psychologist are more heeded today than those of the religious teacher. What we have overcome are only the verbal ghosts and not the spiritual realities which were responsible for the emergence of the gods. We are still just as much obsessed by our autonomous spiritual content as if they were still gods. Nowadays, they are called phobias, and compulsions, neurotic symptoms. In short, the gods have become maladies. Zeus no longer rules Olympus but the solar plexus, and produces freak cases for the medical specialist or disturbs the brains of politicians and journalists, who quite unconsciously foment psychic maladies. Instead of reaffirming that the demon is nothing but illusion, the Westerner has to experience once again the reality of the illusion. He has to learn to recognize these psychic powers, and not to wait until his whims and fancies and crazy ideas make it quite clear to him that he is not sole master in his own house. In this connection it is of no use to lie to oneself. In fixation one is still obsessed. And if one is still obsessed, this means that there is still someone stronger to obsess one. When man begins to turn back onto himself, he does not encounter the dear God whom the modern citizen holds in reserve for contingencies, and is wont to produce at the children's bedtime, but surrenders to the demons. He has roared at tremendous speed through his life, leaving everything which did not suit his conscious ego behind him. If he turns back, he meets the dark cloud of discarded dust and dirt and rubbish which pours over him and darkens the image of the godly opposite to the point of complete extinction. Only as he has the courage to penetrate this dark cloud can man approach nearer to God. Consciousness gives up at this point. It becomes once more an instrument, a function, a vessel into which the unconscious being can void its content. But the content is terrible, for it contains not only the whole past of a personal life, but those elements of the last 5 centuries which were not taken into the rarefied atmosphere of history writing. Within the dark cloud man's guilt is concealed, and by it his destiny is determined when he merely turns his back and refuses to acknowledge it. For there is no alien destiny, no fate which can descend upon man and capriciously kick him around, just as there is no sprightly goddess Fortuna to sweep on her ball before him. Cause and effect are at work in human affairs. The distinctively human freedom reveals itself through spontaneous acts which burst into this internal mechanism from the depths of man, bringing new impulses which may modify it if they are strong enough, but which are then taken up into the causative mechanism. In his regression inwards, man does not design consciousness and commit the sacrifice of the understanding, but has more need than ever of his consciousness, not as a security for his existence, but as a means for hearing and understanding what is said from within. Here consciousness takes a lower seat, and at the height, where it reigned supreme, conscience steps in. And the way to conscience is through memory, recollection. If consciousness has at its disposal conscious thought, which holds things for themselves and stores up and records all that we describe as knowledge, conscience also has the capacity for recording and storing up all that is essential for us. In conscious thought, things appear as our conscious ego has seen them or as it wishes to see them. In memory, things appear as the totality of our being experienced them and perceived them, and as what they meant for us. For that reason, a man who recollects is recovering what as a conscious being he missed or only partially grasped. And in this process of catching up, he at once frees himself from the dark power of demons in himself, who become demonic only because consciousness walled itself off from them. Memory is already the beginning of freedom from the dark power of remembered being and remembered happening. Writes Max Scheler, recollection is usually the way in which experiences take their leave from the core of our life. It is the way in which they get away from the center of the ego, whose attitude to the world they help to fix, and lose their pure drive. It is the way in which they die for us. So little is memory a part of the so-called flow of psychic causation, that it far oftener interrupts this flow and brings sections of it to a standstill. So far from retaining the reality of our earlier life to inject into the present, it far more often releases us from the fatality of this reality. History which we have apprehended mentally frees us from the power of history as actually lived. In turning inwards, man meets the demons behind the crisis. In looking from within outwards, he sees only the effects of forces which he cannot perceive and recognize. Yet the situation is more hopeful, inasmuch as the demons have already become externally visible. The devil, as it were, has become so confident that he no longer troubles to don the mask of simple honesty, to masquerade in bourgeois theatrical props. He steals and robs, plunders and burns, he violates, shames, whips, tortures and murders to his heart's desire. So much has become glaringly apparent, and if we still try to view the scene through the distorting glass of moribund conceptions we have inherited, the pitilessness of the reality cannot be hid. The demons become visible, if only in their meaning for themselves, not their meaning for us. Man certainly already sees man's power-riddled face. He sees what the representative figures which have crystallized out of the collective body look like. But he keeps seeing them only in the visage of the other man. He fails to see himself, because he is still looking from within outwards. If one reads and listens attentively to the diurnal flood of words, man's whole religious and moral indignation seems to be on The alert, ready to rear up and take the defensive against these inhuman distortions. Man sees the condition of other men very accurately. After the sociological weapons for the destruction of the other man through the leveling out of status and class have been taken away, and the political destruction of the other man by defaming him as a member of an ism, recourse is had to religious standards of value to condemn the other, but always the other and never oneself. Human power consciousness continually seeks a scale of values not yet reached by the other man, and finds a subtle gratification of power in destroying the other, and thus confirming self. Man-God once again sits in judgment. In his whole history man has seldom thought so ill of his fellow men as today. He therefore contemplates external events with shuddering horror, but also with a certain satisfaction, approving the crisis as a judgment on the other man. This is the ultimate sublimation of the mathematico-experimental method of perception, which is exploiting moral and religious laws and regulations as it did figures and formulae. Man thrusts between himself and the other man the velum of the Ten Commandments, or the grid of his moral laws. Through this grid he now surveys the other man, and marks the contour of the other's sinfulness on the squares of his graph. From ethical and religious judgment he gains new and mighty energies for annihilating the other. They are, indeed, stronger and more effective than political and social passions. For they hit the other man in the most vulnerable spot, they bedevil him, so that he is very properly handed over for extirpation. Arising from this we see in the West a manhunt on the grand scale. Every man is at once hunter and hunted, and each man, through his own experience, soon learns to use the methods of attack. He is first compelled to employ them in self-defense, but he enjoys the sense of power, and joins the battle of all against all, and calumny and denunciation grow more and more violent. The moral denigration of the other man will in time become dull and ineffective. We are soon accustomed to the idea of the meanness of human beings, both our own meanness and that of our neighbors, when other weapons, to bite more deeply and do more damage, are needed. It may safely be assumed that men will turn back to the witch hunts, torture chambers, and autos of faith of the past. Man will then thrust the velum and the Sermon on the Mount between himself and the other, and test him against it, and the closer man gets by way of political, social and religious affairs to what is specifically Christian, the harder will it be to draw fine distinctions, and the harder will become the Christian task itself. Christianity can only know itself by the scale of grace, and measure itself against love. Perception coming from the conscience may be genuine for him who has attained it and announces it, without having power to control his neighbor. It becomes effective only to the extent to which it can persuade the other man to look for the guilt in himself. But if it present this to him as a demand, it will inevitably become a vexation, in face of which he will become more demonically reserved. It will thus have the effect of making the crisis even more acute. For so long as man lacks a clear vision of interrelations and real causes, so long as he is beguiled by false hopes of an improvement in his situation, or comforts himself with the reflection that it must one day get better because it can't be worse, so long will his conduct display a certain laissez-faire. Let it be, driving nothing to extremes. But let it once be known that the crisis imposes upon the individual the obligation of a regression to himself and a battle with his own demons, then, if all other roads have proved impassable, and the demand is seen to be inescapable, he will harden his heart and use the knowledge not to transform himself but against his neighbor. He will make his relationship to God an object of consciousness, to create for himself an unassailable position from which his will can be enforced, and the other man's guilt established. Civilized despotism, in its political, social and moral garb, must sooner or later reach its end. Its categories have to a large extent already been destroyed, and its driving forces are being exposed. But from the collapse of these categories a religious despotism can easily develop which will light its bonfires to the glory of a God who has been given to the consciousness of man, and has thus become an object of man. We have so far experienced the leaders or Führers. Since Augustus' day they have declared themselves gods, and these gods may be already on the move. But they will become most dangerous if they drape themselves in the mantle of the saints, and the medieval concept of holy Satan becomes a reality. Man is, of course, discovering in his present impasse that there are things of which his science has told him nothing, but consciously or otherwise he is unwilling to change his angle of vision, and continues looking at such things as outside himself. He is also discovering anew the existence of conscience, but discovering it as a fact for itself, and not as a fact for him. He therefore invents the concept of a collective conscience, and comes to terms with that, thus helping a further demon into life. For there is no collective conscience. The phenomena of guilt and atonement do not constitute a living reality within the body collective. Conscience is bound up with the individual existence alone, for it only lights up therein, and it is the tragedy of the false conscience, which manifests itself as a collective formation seeking dominion over the other man, that it blocks his conscience as an individual. The demons of the past take station, historical as well as personal. And their number is legion. And only by freeing his conscience does man regain possession of the inner faculty upon which in very truth his existence is based, because it is the organ which can re-establish polarity with the divine opposite or counterpart. Conscience is the primal faculty of man which makes his existence secure and shows him his path through history. It not only affords Adam but a sufficient image of the perfecting of his being which is to be realized in the course of man's development. It not only knows perfection as an actively vital power opposite it in the form of God, but also retains in memory the enormous treasury of racial experiences, available through conscience and often recalled by its action. Upon his entry into life, writes Passavant, a pair of oars and a compass were given to man, so that he might be able to steer his ship safely through stormy seas to a distant harbor. For he is an immigrant. The oars are his will, the compass his conscience. If he looks collectively upon the latter, and holds the former firmly in his grip, then despite winds and waves he reaches his goal. If he does not row, or rows without regard to the compass, he runs upon the shallows or the rocks. The compass is his law, that law which is written in the heart of every man, which leads him on the safer the more he pays regard to it. Passavant, the conscience. Man's freedom is conferred upon him by his consciousness, which, not embracing the whole of his being nor the whole of his world, circumstantial, cannot tell him with certainty how he should behave. Consciousness is at once the grandeur and wretchedness of man. It is the source of his grandeur, for as the only being who possesses the world instead of being possessed by the world, it makes him Lord of creation. It is also the ground of his wretchedness, for with imperfect faculties he is granted a liberty through which he may violate the law in himself and the law in natural creation, thus exposing himself to punishment from both. He would be wholly lost in liberty without conscience, a faculty pertaining to being, and possessing therefore an insight into the whole of human nature, both the end of man's development and what he must do and avoid doing in order to become what he ought to become. But because he is only in process of development, the vision of his end is not given him by conscience with the clarity and certainty of consciousness possessing something, but is revealed to him only in a dark presentiment, an obscure feeling for something. He achieves insight into conscience only as he retains awareness of his imperfect and unfinished state and knows how to listen to the still, dark voice of it. Man is therefore continually faced with the task of denying his grandeur to avoid falling into a state of wretchedness, or of admitting his wretchedness in order not to fall short of his grandeur. He must therefore continually discipline and chasten that part of his being which has made him Lord of creation. He must subject consciousness to the power of conscience, lest it drown the inner voice upon which the whole of his existence depends. The task becomes the harder the more the assurance of his consciousness increases, and his greatness and importance are daily confirmed. Within the shell of his culture, the center of his nature is then more and more displaced unto consciousness, and he is less and less moved to listen inwardly to conscience, until he surrenders all knowledge of its existence and immures himself in consciousness. At that instant he became a bifurcated creature, leading a conscious existence as an autonomous and completed ego secured upon culture and confirmed by the collective body, while the unrealized part of his being sinks back with conscience into the darkness of the unconscious. It also begins to lead a free and autonomous life, for the autonomy of consciousness establishes the autonomy of the unconscious. The unconscious is subject to different laws and has a different image of perfection from the conscious ego, so that man is in the paradoxical state of aiming as a conscious ego at a target which he himself has selected, while continuing to be directed unconsciously at a target selected for him from which he is unable to release himself. The larger this cleavage becomes, the more is man subjected to what he feels to be destiny. For just as consciously he appropriates the part of his circumjacent world which serves his conscious ego, so does the unconscious part of him, having immediate access to his circumjacent world, exert an influence on it and take possession of all that serves its purpose. Thus the split and internal opposition in man is projected into his circumstantial world, and the more desperately and exclusively the conscious man fights to maintain himself, the more demonically does the unconscious part of his nature attract towards him the things most calculated to make this self-maintenance and immurement in consciousness impossible. The opposition thus projected into the external world, and threatening man's annihilation. As a conscious being, he feels to be destiny advancing upon him from without. Inner division especially characterizes people of high cultures and of the ruling classes, since they are peculiarly tempted to regard themselves as complete and perfect. Modern man, attaining a very high degree of culture, worldwide in its scope, and even reaching into cosmic space, has concluded that he can dispense with all religion, that binding connection between conscience and consciousness, and base human existence upon the autonomy of consciousness. Conformably with this, his destiny, in the form of the external crisis, has grown to such demonic stature that the possibility of the complete annihilation of the world cannot be dismissed out of hand. His future will depend upon his ability to decipher the meaning of the crisis, and to rise to the task it imposes of healing the deep scission in his being. It is the permanent task of human beings to subject consciousness to conscience, and all the technical expedients of religion serve this one end. It is man's tragedy that the task becomes more difficult the nearer he draws to his goal. The temptation to abandon the effort increases as his consciousness grows. Concurrently, the crises and catastrophes which accompany the development of humanity assume ever more violent forms. They grow as it were with man's own growth, and nothing is sillier than the belief that the worst crises occurred at the beginning of his development. The opposite is the case. It is far along his path that temptation becomes strongest. And it is characteristic of its sober realism that Christianity looks for Antichrist to appear in the last days. What finds expression, then, in the historical crisis is the split in contemporary man, perception of his situation, and any helpful influencing of events by man can therefore only be expected from a rediscovery of his conscience, the rediscovery of his wholeness, the healing of the split in his being, and the reemergence of the living power of God will provide a foundation for the individual. Again, since conscience is bound up with the individual and cannot be interpreted by the collective body, perception challenges every man personally and alone, and can be made effective only through the voluntary determination of the individual to turn his back on crisis and collective body alike, and to take himself seriously. Modern man is accustomed to act upon perception. It is obvious to him that something must be done at once, and he judges the value of a perception by whether or not it can tell him what to do. But within the old pattern of action from within outwards, nothing can be done to exert a saving influence upon external events. Anything done in that direction can only make the crisis more acute. Because by such means the demons by whom the man is obsessed become more active. Until he has liberated himself from the demons, man will be like a laser, infecting everything, even the loveliest and most reasonable external system. Were man suddenly given the new world of which he dreams, concerning which the isms plaster the world with gay promises, then unless a new man were created at the same time, the brave new world would in a very short time look exactly like the bad old world of today, and we should be once more fixing our gaze upon the latest thing. A new man can be produced neither by education nor breeding. All the isms give up here, from humanism to communism. The decision required is not to be sought on the usual plane of world affairs, political, economic or social attitudes, but simply and solely in the depths of personal existence. Here the individual can at once do something and get something done. But because he has long been remote from this kind of action, and because he exerts all his force to seize and slam back anything hostile coming his way, he will prefer to go on busying himself in his external world, keeping an eye open for more convenient kinds of knowledge, and such as respect the sphere of private property. For that is man's situation. On the one hand he is anxious to know where the causes of the crisis lie in the meaning of external events, but on the other hand he does not want to know so accurately as to be himself involved in the knowledge. He would like to stay as he is, only modifying the world around him to the extent of abolishing the crisis. But the truth is that he can abolish the crisis only by abolishing what he himself has been and still is, that is to say, by changing himself. The edifice of civilization is collapsing, but at least it still exists. Perhaps it will last a bit longer, albeit a trifle limited and primitive. And things won't be so bad. Here I can at least go on for a while, being the person I was and still am. But the inner refuge into which I could escape does not exist. I have to create it and erect it in my memory, that is to say, I have to make the daring venture of going into complete insecurity and negation and living without any shell at all. And who can face that? The nature of the challenge has been clearly stated by Max Picard. Man has at all times been fleeing from God, but his escape today is more complete. Faith used to be general, there was an objective world of faith in existence. Escape on the other hand was an individual matter, achieved by the individual cutting himself off by an act of decision from the world of faith. He had first of all to create his escape if escape he wished. Today it is the other way around. The external world of faith has been destroyed, and the individual at each separate moment has to create faith anew by an act of decision in releasing himself from an escapist world. For it is an escape world, not a faith world, which today exists externally, and every situation into which a man can get is predeterminedly an escape situation. Everything in the world today exists only in the form of escape. It is of course possible to transform by an act of decision any escape situation, but it takes a lot of doing. And even if an individual succeeds in tearing himself away from the escape world into faith, this has only been done for him, one individual. The escape world goes on existing no matter what he decides. Max Picard, The Flight from God. This means that the man who today dares to face his own demons and to turn inwards to meet his conscience, is not only reminded as an individual of what he used himself to be and is an encounter of annihilating force, but at the same time sees himself in a world which has totally embraced and incorporated him, and desires to halt and hold him in the multiplicity of its daily encounters as precisely the man whom he used to be and still is, a world which absolutely contradicts whatsoever his conscience recalls to him, and rejects and spews out what he desires to be, because it sees its own existence threatened thereby. In his desperate pass man holds to his works, for in these at least the rational being's consciousness has been realized in stone and steel. But the artificial instrumental world collapses, and even where it remains intact it has, by force and terror and despotism, to reduce him to a half man, a quarterman, an eighth of a man, in order to go on functioning without friction, finally reducing him to whatever fraction of his being is necessary to equate being with being conscious, for it can make use of him only as the conscious being which served as basis for its model. It has to demand that he give up his natural being, but in proportion as he renounces being and adapts himself to the world around him and is supported by it, he becomes its thing and is obsessed by it. He ceases to be lord of creation, whether of natural creation or of his own version. He becomes no longer lord of himself or things, but is a football of the demons who obsess him. Without being, man loses his empiry, since as a conscious being he is only able to put a fraction of his true self into play, in order to maintain himself as a person. As lord and master, he has to stake the whole of himself, has to set himself up as a complete being against the complete being of the world, to be able to perceive and recognize it in its whole significance. For him. As a total being, man is something which at one and the same time embraces being and being conscious, the realized and the unrealized. He is something which was and which is, but at the same time something which should be and which must be. As an unfinished and imperfect being he is determinable neither by his past nor by his present, but is to be comprehended only from the future, that is, from the goal of his development. The goal is revealed in the image of the complete and perfect being he bears within him. It cannot be mediated by consciousness, because consciousness can apprehend only a part and not the whole of his nature. The image is made available to him in the inner experience of conscience, in the total unity and plenitude of his being, in which both conscious and unconscious, past, present and future elements of his nature are included. In this totality man experiences perfectness as a truly existent and vitally effective being, to whom he is related and with whom he stands on a reciprocal basis, available to him in meditation and in prayer. 6. A Christian is a free master over all things and slave unto no man, wrote Martin Luther. A Christian is a ready servant of all things and the subject of every man. Thus it is manifest that no external thing can make him free nor virtuous, no matter what it be called, for his virtue and his freedom, or again his wickedness and his imprisonment, are neither bodily nor external. What helps it the soul that the body be uncumbered, fresh and healthy, eats, drinks and lives at its own best? Or again, what harms it the soul that the body be imprisoned, sick and weary, be an hungered and thirsting and be suffering, as it would not wish to do? These things do not reach unto anyone's soul, to free it or to imprison it, to make it virtuous or evil. Consciousness of lordliness would suffice to make manifest the indispensable worth of Christianity in the crisis situation of today, if only because it is the sole force able to release man from being obsessed by the world around him. But we are not concerned in the present investigation with an apologia for Christianity. Our exposition has rather been aimed at two main facts. 1. The modern perception theory cannot aid mankind in the present crisis. The crisis discredits it, so that man is no longer in a position to recognize himself and his world. 2. It is vital for man to get back to conscience, Only through conscience can the individual again find a firm basis and be placed before the image of the divine opposite or counterpart. These conclusions inevitably pose two questions concerning Christianity. 1. Can Christianity restore perception of his own position and of the world to man, without which he is lost? 2. Can it give him strength to encounter the demons in himself and to rediscover conscience? Perception in Christianity means perception of God, an approach on the part of man to the divine counterpart, and to the definitive goal of his existence. As St. Augustine expresses it in a famous sentence, I have need to perceive God, and the soul. Nothing more? No, nothing. Perception of the outer world and of man. In it is, however, included because conscience has two sides, one turned towards God alone, and the other to human existence here. If the degree and value of a perception depend, as we have said, on the extent to which the man is obsessed by the object, and then the extent to which he is able to liberate himself from the obsession, and advance to meet himself and contemplate himself as a nature obsessed by something, then Christianity embodies these two prerequisites of perception in its two fundamental doctrines: love thy neighbor as thyself, and love God above all things. The word love has of course to be divested of the sickliness of bourgeois sentimentality. By love is to be understood an elementary human power available to man's unconscious emotional nature, by which every man is conditioned and sustained, whether he knows it or not. It is significant that in the encounter with the overplus of human nature originally emitted from the modern estimate of man, science is recognizing this aboriginal psychic force. It is the libido of depth psychology, Jung, the sympathy of phenomenology, Schiller, and appears under other terms created by different departments of science. In existentialist philosophy and depth psychology, which have taken fullest account to date of the overplus, and exploded, rationalism is endeavoring to maintain itself within the old categories of consciousness by coining new words and terms for the elementary and unconscious powers. In order to save the autonomy of consciousness, rationalism hangs a cloak round the mysterious and embarrassing remainder of man, to make it fit for social intercourse, and so to introduce it into the old shell of thought. But once the remainder has been admitted, it throws off the cloak and rages inside perilously. Those who let it in are thus compelled to keep hanging fresh cloaks over it in the form of brand new labels, till their scheme of thought ends by getting caught up in the confusion of its terminology and surrendering to the mysterious remainder. Neither existentialist philosophy nor depth psychology has escaped this danger, and things look very turbulent and chaotic in their terminological worlds. The Christian concept of love involves that aboriginal, elementary human force which arises from the total plenitude of being, which wholly envelopes the something drawn into its vortex. It is not only passive and self-surrendering, though it is able to make itself effective in complete seclusion and self-abnegation, but its surrender is utterly removed from the degenerate pallor of the bourgeois, Thorvaldsen type Christ. It goes directly for its objective, and draws it into its magic circle, and can therefore, in a manner most unpleasant to those subject to its attentions, be overmastering, inconsiderate and violent. Love thy neighbor as thyself has very little to do with courageous, Christian love of humankind and gentleness, and most of what we think of in connection with the saying, and regard more or less indulgently. It does, of course, mean showing help to one's neighbor, but the help has little to do with what the other man in his conscious world of images regards as help, and is awaiting. To be able to help a man, I have first to perceive him, get to know him as a total being, and not merely as the conscious one which he displays to him. And I can help him only by showing him the way to the inner unrealized image of his perfected being, which has revealed itself to me in love. With this aboriginal emotional force, and from the unity and fullness of his nature, both what he was and is to be, man apprehends an alien something, in the unity and plenitude of its being, which encounters him where he goes to meet. Modern ethnology describes a similar process when it says that primitive man's soul is united in mystical communion with the thing or person it encounters. Two beings meet wholly and totally, fuse one into the other, and interpenetrate each other. Christian love is distinguished from this primitive process by the values being already included in it, for Christian revelation provides a clear conception of the essence of things and persons. The Christian knows that they are all creations of God, within and behind which God conceals himself, and that man carries within him the yet to be realized image of his perfection at the end of his development. Genesis declares that God created man in his image. In the image of God created he him. It is an enormous and venturesome claim which no other religion has dared to make, and runs close to the limits of hubris. Necessarily implied in it is the expectation that man will one day turn into the divine, the God-man. Therefore always runs the risk of being turned into the man God. It is, however, this image of God and the other man which a priori is the objective of Christian love. It already knows the value present in the other man, no matter how strange the masks and guises in which he cloaks himself. It therefore embraces man from the beginning and from the end of his development, and can take a relative view of him in the interregnum, of that manifest but delusive part of his nature which provokes resistance, not disregarding it, and indeed taking it all the more earnestly because the scale of values has been given, but not taking it as absolutely true. Love for one's neighbor as for oneself is directly connected with the other Christian doctrine: love God above all things. In love for his neighbor, or for an animal, or for anything, man becomes another person, a person obsessed who has himself become this neighbor being, in the regression of love towards God. However, man is released from the state of obsession, and as one who is nothing in the sight of God, emerges to meet this neighbor being in himself, whom he can now see clearly in the reality and truth of his being, and help to bring this neighbor nearer the goal of perfectness. The Christian God is at the same time both a person and a supreme value. This is unique to Christianity as the highest manifestation of religion in human history. In loving his neighbor and loving God, the Christian becomes an envoy, who unrestrictedly meets the being opposite to him on the horizontal plane, and adapts it to his spirit so as to place it with himself before the vertical. As both person and supreme value, the Christian God enables man, in spite of his self-immolation before his opposite on the plane of the vertical and the horizontal, to remain himself, all the more strongly and individually a person the more intensively and exclusively he can give himself to God and his neighbor, while the supreme value is made accessible to him in a form which does not extinguish but enlarges his consciousness into spirit. All other religions elevate man's person, while extinguishing his consciousness. Christianity alone brings man to a stage of development where both his person and his consciousness are retained before the counterpart of God. In Christian perception, which arises from the aboriginal emotive force of love, the being of the alien something not only opens itself to man in its full plenitude, but reveals to him at the same time the value inherent in himself and the aim of perfection to which he is himself directed, so that the man not only frees himself from obsession by the alien something, but releases it also to its highest values. The being of this alien something is made clear to him in its meaning for him, as a completely conscious and unconscious, realized and unrealized being, and evaluated according to its power to draw him nearer the perfection he is to attain. The hope being that creation as well as man would one day be freed from its thraldom to decay and gain the glorious freedom of God's children. To this day, we know, the entire creation sighs and throbs with pain, and not only so, but even we ourselves, who have the Spirit as a foretaste of the future. Even we sigh deeply to ourselves as we wait for the redemption of the body that means our full sonship. Romans 8:21-23. In this form, perception is a vital inner process which envelopes the whole man, and according to its degree influences the percipient and the object of perception. Perception and being are identical here, and increase together just as culture and consciousness grow together. But the antithesis between being and being conscious, which has split man's nature to the limit of self-destruction, is absent. True perception is really a path and a truth in life all in one. It does not drag action after it, but perception and realization are here one and the same thing. If Western man is today indifferent to the Christian faith, it is mainly because he fails to realize its meaning and his immediate actual need, living on memories of the security and certainty he has lost, which are vivid enough to help him over the facts of illness, age, death and guilt, mastered by the idea of completion, and upborne by the hope that the crisis cannot last forever, but must one day end of itself and his lost security be restored to him. He is unable to realize the need of Christian faith. The shell of technical civilization was erected in spite of Christianity, and developed without love. It sprang from a form of perception, which sought and created power. Having brought it to perfection, man is faced by the dread fact that he himself will be destroyed within it unless he can build love into his edifice. Technical civilization has thus set him an enormous task, and seeing its gigantic power, he must in deepest grief ask himself whether mankind can rise to the needed plenitude of love. Only in the degree in which he approaches God can he be liberated from obsession and through love regain possession of the elemental force which is appropriating his creations. To the question whether Christianity can restore to man the perception of the world and himself without which he is lost, therefore, we can give a decided affirmative. Only on a Christian basis can his existence again be made secure. The second question, is Christianity able to give man the strength to meet the demons within and rediscover his consciousness? Is obviously closely bound up with the first, but from one standpoint Christianity can be regarded as an object for consciousness with which intellectually man comes to terms. The second question is concerned with his being on the far side of consciousness, and it is only as it reaches the inner kernel of his being, and overcomes the scission in his nature that Christian faith can regain its life. Very little has been gained by the realization that consciousness is at the end of its tether, and hence of man's need to look within himself to find his conscience. True in the rediscovery of his conscience, man has taken the path to God, but he does not straightway discover God, but only his own evil conscience. Man's destiny, as we have seen, resides in the dark cloud he trails behind him, and which he desires to have regarded as his own private affair. In that sense the destiny of the world and of mankind has indeed become a very private affair, and cleaning up man's circumstantial world might as well cease, if it is to be carried out by persons not themselves cleaned up, for it will soon enough be in ruins again. The important matter is not so much the rediscovering of conscience, already so potent in man that it threatens to overwhelm him and drive him to flight, but whence is man to get the strength to place himself at the disposal of conscience? Whence is he to get the will to will? His conscious will is too weak, because it is split and the part missing from the first part resides autonomous within the cloud of guilt swirled up by his own life and half a millennium of historic development, and is demonically opposing him. He needs another power to venture himself within the cloud, a power to be found in God alone, for there is no other power in this interregnum of demons. Thus we have the paradoxical situation that man, desiring to pass through the black cloud where his guilt and destiny reside in order to find God, needs God first to be able to enter in on the path at all. He must already have found what he is seeking to be able to seek. At this point human reason and the human will resign, and in view of the paradox, religion sets its sober pessimism against the shallow abstract optimism of the isms. Human reason, says Donoso Cortes, is quite unable to convert a single man in respect of the questions which concern his salvation. All the slick rhetoric of Demosthenes and Cicero will never save a single soul. Luther judged matters as soberly and realistically: there is no man fit and able to better his life himself, and as to that bettering of lives whereof thou speakest, which happeneth without spirit and without faith, the Lord maketh nothing of it, for it is work of nothing but hypocrites. Elect persons and virtuous, however, will better themselves by God, His grace and Spirit; the others will go to wreck and ruin unbettered. Thus man, on turning back to the dark cloud of his own guilt, is forced to accept what has in fact only been awaiting him beneath the cloud. This is the second important point where Christianity is becoming a matter of life and death for Western man today. The passive and introspective man of the East has never ripped away his connection with his inner world to the extent of the extrovert of the West. Western man was forced to tear himself free of nature and of the soul in order to take action against them. Now that regression inwards has become a question of life and death, he is repeatedly urged to follow the methods of the East. But they are valueless to him since they provide no release from personal guilt. C.G. Jung, who has studied Eastern methods most exhaustively, very rightly says, "It is not a question of imitating some inorganic alien faith, but of men building up Western culture, which suffers from 1,000 ills, on the spot. If we succeed in bringing a second or even a third psychic function to such dignity as has been attained by the intellect, then the West has every expectation of considerably outstripping the East." C.G. Jung, The Secret of the Golden Blossom. The men of high culture at the inception of Christianity knew guilt. They carried its influence in the division of their being. They stood, as we should call it today, in the very center of nihilism. The doctrine of the forgiveness of sins and the atonement for guilt by the Savior exercised so mighty a liberating force upon them, that in the midst of the decline of other cultures the Christian became a new man and began a new life upon which it was possible to found our bimillennial Western culture. The undeveloped peoples who adopted the new doctrine together with the works of classical culture were not equally cognizant of guilt, for they were at a stage antecedent to culture, whereas classical man suffered from the cycle of cultures and sought escape from them, that is, from his guilt. These peoples were in need of release from fear and anguish, but not from a culture and a guilt they did not yet possess. Inasmuch as these peoples subjected themselves in Christianity to an asceticism which released them both from nature and the body, they created the inner prerequisites for just that culture which has attained its perfection in the unnatural bodiless and soulless technical civilization of today. It is only now that these peoples are meeting the problem of guilt, though a guilt far more gigantic than that of the year one, and it is consequently only today that they begin to approach the historico-development level of the year one. Thus it is only now that the question bursting forth from the depths of these peoples really touches the kernel of Christianity. Whence does man gain the strength to come to terms with his guilt? Who gives him the willpower to turn against the evil conscience in him, and how does he manage to find through the dark cloud of evil trailing behind him a way to God, unless the strength is brought to him in advance to venture along this path? With one tug these questions tear away the veils from the kernel of Christian faith and its liberating doctrine of the forgiveness of sins, that is to say, the removal of guilt. When Christianity thus speaks of its own affairs alone, the burden of reproach which for 2,000 years it has had to bear as the only power through which the ancient cultures were delivered to the young peoples of the West, falls away. It is scarcely possible through a doctrine of release from guilt for men suffering from the cycle of cultures, to deliver the culture and the will for redemption to men who lack the culture and therefore the guilt, without causing much harm. A conflict of interests must arise, and either culture or doctrine will fall short. To this day Christianity has had to go hand in hand with the state and culture, and at the cost of its own doctrines. Do a mighty work of education, without which our whole technical civilization would be unthinkable. But if it is now to be approached by men who have their eye on liberation from works and the guilt thereof, it is bound to draw back and resume its original task, once again taking up a position on the far side of the state and of culture, such as it had up to the 3rd century. The churches as the representative structures of Christendom must therefore once more make it clear that they are standing on the outside, beyond culture and the state, and against technical civilization. They must again pass as otherworldly and alien through an age which has had its fill of the familiar world and, feeling sick and remaining empty, is hungering for something more. By the issue of a translation of culture, created by the countries of the West and originating from Constantine, it became an obvious and accepted rule that in every place where culture and the state were, there also was the church. That is no longer possible today. The paths separate when the opposition between spirit and power has become clear and keeps emerging more sharply, and now that man's life has once again been set under the duality of God and devil, spirit and power, state and church, where the first attempts at totality displayed themselves, the division was bound to make itself manifest, and indeed it did become public knowledge, and has for a long time been producing Christian martyrs again. But we have only experienced the first squall against the totality towards which technical civilization seems forced to steer, and under which in the unity of the apparatus and the collective body it has to bring man in the closed room of a united world, the church must stand. The church can only be outside and beyond such a totality. It can only answer man who is beginning to ask how he can be liberated from his guilt from outside, even though the outside be in the desert or the catacombs. For, to return to the situation of the individual man, with the dark cloud containing his guilt and destiny behind him, and the impassable wall before him, he can be helped and liberated only if from till to some quarter strength is given him to carry out a complete regression inwards, and start on the path through the cloud to God. The isms are sticking up gay posters on the wall before man, giving the illusion of windows through which he can see the promised land. But if they get the power for which they thirst, the posters will not be renewed, but hang down tattered and torn, showing once more the grey wall, behind which mankind is held in greater serfdom than ever before. Man is becoming quite sick of the glimpses of the promised land. He is beginning to suspect that the only thing before him is a grey, dirty, immutable and inescapable barrier. Nor does he succeed in the attempt to overcome his own division, since he encounters the black cloud enshrouding his guilt, now grown gigantic, lowering on him, wherein reposes his evil conscience, which has, as it were, laid an embargo on all the forces of his nature. Anyone desirous of helping man to cease being the one he is, and to become the other he has to be, must first be able to tell him that the guilt of the one has already been smoothed out and forgiven. In the first look the man dares cast backwards, and in the first question about himself he dares put, regression and reply are already comprehended. As Nicholas of Cusa said, here there opens up before us the solution of the mystery, namely that the seeker presupposes what he seeks and yet at the same time does not presuppose it, inasmuch as he is seeking it, or as Pascal said more precisely, thou wouldst not seek after me unless thou hadst already found me. To the second pungent question also Christianity can alone give the appropriate answer. Luther gave it in his two great words: faith and grace. Soul fide, sola gratia. Soul faith, soul grace the end.